we're still stuck in this where we think of people and treat people like machines to be optimized, to be tweaked. The problem is that doesn't work for human performance. They're not managing machines. They are managing these developing, imperfect human beings who have needs and are facing obstacles and really want to be successful. And if they're not, then that means there's something going on that you need to solve for them or help them with. And when you get that shift made, things start to change.
Jason Lauritsen is an author, a keynote speaker, and a leader trainer, and has been named to the top 100 HR tech influencer by HR Executive Magazine, a top 100 HR influencer by Engagedly, and a top 100 global employee engagement and experience influencer by Inspiring Workplaces. He also is the author of 2 books, Unlocking High Performance, How to Use Performance Management to Engage and Empower Employees to Reach Their Full Potential, and Social Gravity, Harnessing the Natural Laws of Relationships. Both are available on Amazon. Jason, welcome to Voices of HR.
Berta, I am delighted to be here.
Well, we are delighted to have you here because this is a hot topic and you have a unique perspective, and I cannot wait for our Voices of HR audience to hear all about it. So let's just kick this thing off. Let's have you share your opinion, because it's a strong opinion, that you feel that once a year performance employee appraisals are not just flawed, but are actually harmful to an organization. Tell us more.
I tell you what, it's a lot. I mean, I wrote a whole book about it. I feel so strongly about this topic. So I think let's do it on 2 levels. I think at the most basic level, the process itself has some really serious design flaws. One being that we often anchor it to ratings, numbers. There's a fair amount of data out there about rater bias that, rating when a human evaluates the performance of another human and puts a number on it, that rating says more about the bias of the rater than it does about the person being evaluated. So a performance evaluation is actually evaluating the manager, I guess. I don't know, but that doesn't work. It's not how learning and growth work either. Once a year feedback. Can you imagine sending your child to an elementary school and they said, we only do 1 test a year. We're going to only evaluate learning 1 time a year at the very end of the year, and we'll give them a grade, and then on you go. Like, no evaluation, no feedback, right? That's ridiculous. We know that human learning requires constant and regular feedback. And so, I mean, I could go on and on and on. So the process itself is flawed. But worse than that is that we have decades of employee engagement research, employee sentiment research, that tells us that the primary things that consistently and reliably drive employee engagement, and employee engagement, by the way, by my definition, is the degree to which an employee is willing and able to perform up to their potential. So they're willing to do it, so they're choosing to do it, and they're able to do it. It's all about performance. And so we have all this engagement data that says that in order for me to do that, I need to feel valued, cared for, appreciated, and trusted at work. I mean, you can go great places to work, Gallup, best places to work surveys, you name it. They all say the same thing. They come down to these same basic things. And what those things are telling us is that employees experience work as a relationship. Right? Those are relational things. Care and trust and appreciation and feeling valued. They need to feel like they're in a healthy relationship with work. That means we have to build healthy relationships. And you take this tool, this once a year tool, where we save up all of our feedback for the whole year and we dump it on you all at once. And that makes you defensive, which is anti-learning, and it doesn't actually help. And so can you imagine if that's how we showed up in any relationship, right? It doesn't work. And so on a very fundamental level, it actually violates the relationship. It violates trust. It violates, it doesn't make people feel valued. It doesn't make you feel appreciated. It actually does the opposite when we do it the way that we've traditionally designed it. So that's a long answer to it, but it's a big question. Why is this broken? The list is very long, but those are some of the biggest answers.
And I think to put an exclamation point on that, my favorite is getting calls from individuals, could be an executive, could be a senior manager, and they've never heard the feedback before. I think that's always the worst, right? Not only is it a list, but it's a list of things that you've never heard before. So you've never had the opportunity to actually get better at it or say, here's where I need training. And it does feel like a little bit of a firing squad, right? At the end of the year.
It sure
Now,
does.
you have
Well,
also
and
said,
the other thing is that, and I think the other faulty part of the design is that many organizations still connect this albatross to compensation decisions.
mm-hmm,
The bottom line is, I think that's the other part of this that makes it feel, I think, particularly gross to employees, is that this process by itself is terrible. And then, oh, by the way, on top of it, you're now using this terrible process to impact my ability to support myself or my family or to advance my career. And that's just insult to injury. So there's a lot of bad stuff.
So I'm sitting here listening to you, and all I keep thinking is about the horror stories that I've heard. So, just for our audience, I mean, our audience is HR. They hear horror stories all the time. That's their job. What is the worst example that you have heard about a year end appraisal? How did it go?
The one that I love to talk about is, it was at an organization I worked at where this was the COO of the organization, and he had a person on his team who he had been working with for a long time. And so very literally every year, all he did, he would cut and paste the exact same content from one year to the next into the appraisal and then submit it through. Exact same content. And neither one of them cared. They were fairly senior people. Neither one of them cared. And so, HR was like, why fight this? And so, when you think about that, it's like, okay, if the executives at the top of the organization think so little of this process, that this is how they treat it, why are we doing it? Like, what are we doing? I don't understand.
I think your point about it reflecting more of them than it does the person, right? Or sometimes even the direction of the organization. If there are layoffs coming or if there's a firing coming, right? You see it all the time in organizations who want to rid themselves of a group of employees or mass layoffs. And so all of a sudden, they've always received great performance appraisals, and then all of a sudden the numbers decline significantly. So it does. And I always tell people your year-end appraisal is not a reflection. It just can't be for a lot of the reasons that you've mentioned. So let's start talking about solutions, because we have a group of HR professionals that listen to this podcast. And I suspect a majority of them are sitting there thinking to themselves, okay, we are so entrenched in this annual review, or even maybe they've even gotten to quarterly reviews. And so they've actually progressed a little bit and are sitting there thinking, I can't imagine the work that it's going to take coming off of COVID and everything else that they have prioritized, the work that it's going to take to change the appraisal process. Can you lead us through maybe one, two, or three things that they can do to help themselves progress over a period of time? Or should they just rip off the Band-Aid and change everything?
So much of that depends on the circumstance. So I completely get that you're buried, right? You're buried. You've got 1,000 other priorities. We know this process sucks, but and here's the big but. The big but in it is that everybody hates it. Like we've at an organization where we actually did this work, we surveyed and we found out, we surveyed like employees, leaders, and we actually included HR in the survey, get feedback. And guess what? Managers hate it, employees hate it, and HR hates it. Everybody hates it. But then the moment you say, we're going to just stop doing it then, or we're going to take it away, for some reason, the leaders grab it. They're like, well, what? Wait a minute. What? We can't do that. Right? Because it's the one time a year I do something around management, around performance. And that is the problem. And so if we're going to be pragmatic about it, there's play the long game, number one. And if you want to think about the long game in replacement, and this is not, I usually don't, I don't show my book like hardcore, but one of the things I put in the book because it was so helpful for me and I wanted to lay
which
it
one?
out.
Because you have
Unlocking high perperformance. Unlocking high performance.
Unlocking
Pretty
high
much everything
performance.
I'll talk about today is in unlocking high performance because we're talking about performance. And this was sort of my, I guess, my love letter to HR. Like, here's how you fix this. It's not supposed to be an appraisal or an event. It's a system. But there's the last section in the book is a section about design and how to use design process to move your organization through a process to arrive at a better set of processes and outcomes and skills that are needed to manage performance. But it's a design, and design starts with, what are we trying to solve for? Who are we trying to solve for? What do they need? What are we trying to accomplish? Defining that and then starting to work on solutions. And so it is a long process. You should not just go buy something from another technologist or whatever that will not solve your problem. So what I would recommend instead is, you don't need to fight that battle in the short run. In the short run, if you have an appraisal process, the one thing I would highly, highly recommend, well, two things, if you can get done, if there's two hills to die on, it is get the numbers out, get the ratings out.
So remove those.
Remove the ratings. You can still do an assessment or an appraisal, but make it narrative. Narrative is where the meat is anyways. That's where the information is. Get rid of the ratings because the ratings are so flawed on so many levels. Talk about that in the book too, if you want that. It gives you the references on how to fight back, what the research says about that. But that's one. And two is decouple it from compensation. We can talk more about that in a minute if you can, but decouple it. Put them on different cycles. I know you're thinking, well, how do we make compensation decisions without performance appraisals? We'll talk about that in a minute. But those are the two things that I would, in the short run, fight for. But even if you can't do that, what you should be doing instead is focus on equipping managers with the skills to be managing and coaching performance on a regular real-time basis. And so that's really where you should put your effort, because what you want happening is you want managers who are creating the conditions for performance, that are managing and coaching performance on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, because performance literally happens in a day-to-day basis. And so you need to equip them with the skills on how to create clarity about expectations, how to provide effective feedback, how to identify and diagnose issues when they come up and deal with them at the moment they're happening, because otherwise it's just going to become a bigger and bigger and bigger issue. And if they're doing all of those things, when they get to the performance appraisal process, all that's going to be, and all it should ever be, is sort of a year in review. We're going to sit down. Let's review kind of the journey we've been on. Let's talk about the wins. Let's talk about the things that we've agreed that we want to work on next year. And let's put most of our focus on how we're going to perform next year, what our focus is going to be, what we need to learn next year. And so if you're managing throughout the year, then nothing should be a surprise in that appraisal. Now, if you don't have the luxury, if it's coming up, you're coming up on it, you don't have a lot of time, at the very, very least, encourage your managers to have some calibration conversations with their people ahead of the actual appraisal itself. Have the conversations, talk through the year, get on the same page, and then just create the appraisal almost as a documentation of that conversation. So at the end of it, that way it's not a surprise to the employee. It should feel like a collaborative process between the manager and employee. So that's a bunch of ways to make it less harmful.
So I hear a couple of things coming out of that. And that was number one, prepare your leaders for the change and to become much more of a coach, hands on, day to day, and not wait for even a quarterly conversation or a weekly conversation. I think, but having said that, most people in manager roles have either not been trained or prepared adequately to even have these conversations. There is so much content out there about how best to give feedback. And I always think about it as if you care about the individual, that's where you start.
Yeah,
Or
I
if it's part
I
of their
agree.
expectation at the beginning of the year, right? You said you wanted to get better at X. I just saw you do Y. Let's talk about the difference. So, number one, how best can you prepare a group of employees, the leaders, for this conversation or to actually change their, I guess it's their management approach or their leadership approach?
Yeah, what a big question.
It is a big question.
I think fundamentally, I spend so much time working with leaders and managers on mindset shift, because I
Mm,
think it starts on that fundamental of a level that so much of what we have been trained in, if you have had training or what you've experienced even if you've never had any training, you just kind of kept
mm,
getting promoted, what you've experienced is a production style of management that was
mhm,
born out of the Industrial Revolution, in an era where we were taking people off the farm, putting them in factories
mhm,
to basically do jobs that were better suited for machines, but we didn't have the technology to build those machines yet. So we had to get people to behave like those machines. And the invention that we had to create in order to get people to do that was something called management. So it very literally, the invention of management was to get, and Gary Hamel said this most beautifully, I quote him all the time, is to get human beings to perform like semi-programmable robots.
mm,
And so that's the legacy of
mm,
management. And so we've had trouble breaking that legacy, because
mhm,
that's where it started, and we've just been making small tweaks on that. And the problem with that is that we're still stuck in this where we think of people and treat people like machines to
mhm,
be optimized, to be tweaked. And it shows up most commonly like when someone's not performing well, like you can see it vividly there, because like what happens if you have a piece of machinery that's not performing well? What do? You fix the machine or you replace the machine,
mhm,
right? That's general. Like what else do you do? Well, what do we do with most employees? We They're not performing. We have performance improvement plans. We try to fix the machine, fix the employee, or else we're going to replace you with a different machine.
mhm,
The problem is that doesn't work for human performance. Works great for machines because that's how machines work. But the problem is for human performance, it doesn't work that way. So I teach this concept called the cultivation mindset, which comes out of more so how farmers and gardeners think about their
mm,
job, in that we don't have to force or coerce performance. People are inherently and naturally motivated to grow and develop. That's in our DNA. If you've ever been around a small child, we know this to be true. They learn like sponges. We learn how to speak and walk by just being around other humans, right? It's pretty incredible. So we are hardwired for that. And I think people also fundamentally will always choose to succeed over failing when given the means and opportunity to do so. I think every
mhm,
person I've ever met, if you gave them the opportunity to choose between, hey, you can succeed today or you can fall on your face, they're always going to choose succeed. And so when you take those two things together, then our job as managers is not to We don't need to evaluate, to fix, to, coerce people into performance. We need people to think about their roles as setting the environment to foster growth, to cultivate growth. We need to understand, what do people need? What drives performance? We need to understand what obstacles are in the way, and we need to get those obstacles out of the way so that people can do the work. And so this is a long way of answering your question, but I think it starts with, it's almost like a software upgrade that we need to make for managers and leaders. We need to help them understand that their job isn't about, they're not managing machines. They are managing these growing, these developing, imperfect human beings who have needs and are facing obstacles and really want to be successful. And if they're not, then that means there's something going on that you need to solve for them or help them with. And when you get that shift made, things start to change. And then you have to obviously equip them with the tools, simple tools on how to do that work, right? How to how to make lines in your garden and how to pull the weeds. And if we go back to that analogy, you still need those. You have to do that work and you have to have those skills. But if you don't understand if you treat your garden like a machine, it's not going to produce much of a harvest. So that's where it starts.
So start with upgrading your leadership.
Yep.
And shifting their mindset.
Yep.
To adapt.
Yep.
From machine to more like a farmer.
Yep.
Cultivating and learning. Now, step number 2. So you've got your leadership aligned. Now I just keep thinking about the beginning of the year conversation.
Yep.
So
Exactly
we're talking
right.
about the end of the year conversation. What kind of advice would you give to these leaders who have shifted their mindset? They're preparing to be a better leader of their people throughout the year. What kind of conversation should they have at the beginning of the year?
Well, there's the kind of conversation is about, what kind of outcomes or goals do we have for the conversation? And so I would say there's two big things that you want to do in that conversation in terms of, what are my objectives? Number one is to achieve clarity of expectations. And so that there's perfect clarity, as much as it can be achieved, between the leader and the employee on what needs to be accomplished, how we're going to go about accomplishing it, and how we're going to measure it. And that doesn't, pick whatever timeline, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, whatever it is that makes sense for that particular role. Could be a month or a week. Whatever. The second objective is to build relationship, right? Build trust. Make sure that you're doing it in a way that advances the relationship and strengthens that. And to do that, you want to the extent you can, you want to involve the employee in the conversation, in collaboratively sorting through what it's going to look like. So sometimes that can be actually creating those goals or objectives together, right? Together, talking those through and agreeing on what is a reasonable goal and why, and calibrating, prioritizing. Sometimes that's not an option. Sometimes your goals get passed down. You're in sales. Here's your number. Like, okay, right. This is the number. Neither one of us have any influence over that necessarily, or maybe it just is what it is. So now how are we going to get to that? That's the number. Let's break it down and let's talk about the strategies or the approaches or the how, and let's collaboratively define that. So it's you think about it in the way that you would set or approach any important goal with any other significant relationship in your life. Mm-hmm. I think about if my wife and I had a particular goal for our family, whatever it was, we really want to go on a trip to Europe, take our kids to Europe for 2 weeks. What's that going to look like? We would sit down and plan that out together. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't show up and say, we're going to Europe. Here's what we need to do. Here's what you're going to do. Here's what they're going to do. And good luck. Let me know what you need. All right. That's not how you do it in a relationship. You do it together. And so I think those are the two big things. But the key is build the relationship, achieve clarity.
All right, so now I'm thinking about an individual who is not very self aware. And so at the beginning of the year, they have a deficit in a certain aspect of their performance. And this is where I think most leaders shy away from having candid conversations that are caring, that are helpful, because that's your job as a leader, right? To be helpful. So, can you walk us through a situation? And this is for HR as well, right? Because
Yep.
HR still wants to manage performance,
Yep.
right? They're responsible for the productivity of a group of people. So, real quick, how would you encourage the leader to have a deficit conversation at the beginning of the year?
Well, it depends. It depends on the circumstance that led to that. So the thing with adopting a cultivation mindset, what I teach is that if you have an employee who's not performing, that is your fault.
Mm,
It's not their fault. That is your fault because you've done there's something along the way that you have allowed to happen or you've made some decisions, you put that employee in a spot where they're not succeeding.
mm,
And we know that they would prefer to be succeeding. So they're not choosing not to succeed. And so
mhm,
what are we going to do to address that? And so where I always advise leaders, managers, HR to start is the first thing you have to do if you have a deficit, performance deficit, is you have to diagnose what's going on. Like what is the issue? And right, the first thing we often do, the instinct is, well, how do I fix that person?
mm,
It's like, well, let's start with a different assumption. Let's start with an assumption there's nothing wrong with this person. Right? This person has some needs that are unmet that would allow them to perform, or there's an obstacle that's in their way that they cannot
mhm,
navigate around. So that's what we have to figure out is we have to have a conversation about this because achieving those expectations is a non-negotiable for both of us.
mhm,
My job is to make sure you're performing. Your job is to meet those expectations. So both of us are not meeting our expectation in this moment. It's not the employee. We're in it together. And so let's figure it out. There's 5 drivers of performance. If you want to, we can talk about them in more detail, but they, in order of importance, go clarity, feedback, ability, capability, and want to, desire.
mhm,
We usually start with the last one because we think that's what's wrong. And that is almost never what is wrong.
mm,
It is almost always a lack of clarity,
mm.
almost always. And so when you address that, everything changes. And Bert, I can give you, if you don't mind, I can tell a quick story to illustrate
Oh, would
how
love
this
that.
works. Yeah.
Love it.
From my own experience, because most of this I learned on the wrong side of things. I had a couple good leaders, and I learned from them, like how okay, this is why this works good.
Mhm,
So for me, what it was is this was my very first HR role. I came into HR uh, as a recruiter. I was running a recruiting team, so I was hired as like a recruiting manager. I'd been running a headhunting agency before this, so I came in. I had never worked in HR. I'd never worked in a corporate environment. So I was a bull in a
mm,
china chop. I didn't understand politics. I didn't understand all the dynamics or whatever. I was a sales guy and a recruiter, which means like, and I was taught if you're a third party recruiter, you're taught you
right.
run over HR. Like you step
Oh,
on the back of their necks as you're going to the hiring manager because that's how you get people hired. It's terrible. And so, and so here I am now in HR trying to make sense of all this, and I operate like a sales guy. And so I'd been there. I take over this underperforming team, and I think I don't remember how long it had been that I had been there, but I'd had to replace some people and systems and whatever. And our team was like based on the numbers, we were crushing it.
mm,
We were crushing it. Our numbers, like the time to fill and number of open jobs and our turnover of new hires, all of that, we're crushing it. And so I get my first ever performance appraisal. So it circles back to performance appraisals. First ever performance appraisal I've ever had. And I'm walking in there like, this is going to be awesome. Like, this is what fives are. This is why they put a 5 on there.
For you, for
Just
Jason.
for this kind. Yeah. I just
Yeah,
showed
yeah.
everyone what a 5 is. You're welcome. And so I'm walking into the conversation with this is my mindset. And so, and of course I walk in, I sit down, my boss gives me the performance appraisal, the printed out, right? Because that's how we do it. It's a sneak attack, right? You just,
Right.
the first time you're going to see it's when you show up. And and I get this. So we go through it, and she's giving me this, my feedback, and she gives me credit for all the good stuff, all this stuff. Like, yep, you're doing great on this, you're doing great on this, whatever. Thanks for all this. However,
Ooh, the
it
however.
turns out that my style of working was not rubbing my HR peers the right way. And so apparently there'd been sort of a steady stream of complaints and issues and grievances that had been coming to her nonstop. I was creating drama all over the place, I guess.
Wow.
Didn't know.
Didn't know
Partly
that.
because I didn't care. I wasn't paying any attention to any of this. And so she docked my rating fairly significantly for this. And I was like, wait a minute. You didn't tell me, you never told me that I needed to care about what these people thought of me. Like, you didn't, like, this wasn't anything that I know that sounds completely naive as a guy that wrote a book about relationships and the importance of, like, it sounds ridiculous now. But I'm like, you never told me any of this was important. I didn't know I needed to care about what they thought about how I worked. I thought you just wanted me to perform because these are the numbers you told me to hit. This is what we're doing. And so she's like, apparently this is important. So she tells me, it became abundantly clear to me in that moment, right? I'm that person that you just talked about, performance deficit. So here's an executive, has a person like me, performance deficit. So what are you going to do to fix me? You didn't need to fix me. I just needed to know it was important.
Right.
Because the moment that became clear to me, I fixed it. It changed because now I knew, oh, wait a minute. You're measuring me on this? Okay, fine. Now I understand. I'll fix it. I'll make sure we're all feeling like a nice, happy family because it matters to you, I guess. I don't know how it helps my performance. This was my mindset at the time, but like this matters. I'll fix it. And so I tell you all of that to say that we're so quick to be like, okay, how do we fix this employee? And 90% of the time, it's either they aren't clear on what's expected or they had no idea that they weren't meeting the expectation. So it's a failure of clarity of expectation or a failure of feedback, almost always. And that's on the leader.
I love that you are making the employee's performance a responsibility of the leader. Because far too often, what do you hear? It's never their issue. It's always pointed back at the employee. And you're absolutely right. If there's a gap, their job is to help them fill it.
Yep.
To help them get better.
Or we blame employees, or who else do we blame? We blame HR. Right? Because if HR didn't bring me such crappy people, then I would be fine. It's like, well, I keep sending you great people, and guess what? None of them work. There's one common denominator in here. What is it? It's the manager. And it's not, and the thing is, it's not because it's a bad manager. It's just they don't have the skills or the tools. They don't know. And until we fix that, we keep sending them people, and these poor employees, right, get put in the meat grinder.
Yeah. So you have leaders that need a mindset shift. You have clear expectations that need to be set, clarity at the beginning of the year.
Yep.
What should they do throughout the year to help employees be successful?
Most important thing is regular, scheduled, one-on-one conversations with their teams. Every person on the team. And that's important for a couple of reasons. It's important, number one, because we talked earlier, work is a relationship. The most important driver of that relationship for majority of employees is the relationship they have with their immediate manager, right?
Hands down.
Your immediate manager is
Mhm.
the relationship of the organization for a lot of employees. And
Of
so
course.
you've got to invest in that. And the inconvenient part of this is that time is the currency of relationships. You cannot build relationships without an investment of time. And so you have to make time. So you make time, regular one-on-one meetings. Ideally, I would say in most circumstances, it's once a week. For some situations, it might be longer depending on the nature of the relationship, how long you've been working together, type of job, all of that. You have to make, sometimes it's once a day if it's, a 5-minute or 10-minute check-in with someone. Depends on the nature of it. Primary, so there's two objectives you can have for, or you should have for a one-on-one meeting. Again, and it's very similar. Number one, build relationship. So it always starts with personal check-in, checking in on the human being, because if the human being's not okay, then all the other stuff doesn't really matter, right? If I'm struggling, if my marriage is falling apart, or I just found out that I have a best friend that's got cancer, or I've got a substance abuse issue that I'm wrestling with, whatever. If I have a severe well-being issue that I'm wrestling with, like we can have the best conversation about performance that you've ever had, doesn't matter, because I don't have anything to give you anyways. And so
Right.
you got to check in on the human, make sure the human's okay. So that's number one. Then number two is you have a conversation about performance. And I have a sort of a template of questions that I recommend that managers, leaders start with. If you've not been having these conversations and you're going to start, there's 4 or 5 questions depending on how often you do them. But here's what they are. Number one is, what's the most important thing we need to talk about today?
Mm.
First question, always. And there will be one-on-one meetings where you never get past that, because whatever they bring up, if you sit down with your best person and they say, you know what, I got a call from a recruiter yesterday and it's really got me thinking, like, okay, whatever else I thought I wanted to talk about is now not important to me. Let's talk about this and figure this out. So what's the most important thing we need to talk about today? Number two is, what are the most significant things you've accomplished since the last time we met? The reason this is important is, and actually, so I'm going to give you the template here in a second. So let me go through all of that. What's the most important thing you've accomplished since the last time we met? What are your top priorities to accomplish before next time we meet? What obstacles are you facing right now? Or what challenges are you facing? And what kind of support do you need from me? How could I be of more support to you in this next cycle? So those questions are the common questions. And what I recommend is that both the manager and the employee both complete this in advance. So you should have these questions. You know you're going to talk about these. You both do it in advance, so that when you sit down, you're not only making sure that you're getting the most important things out, you're focusing on the most important things, but you're also doing an alignment exercise. This is a clarity check, right? So you're when that employee says, here's the top 3 most important things I've accomplished since the last time we met, and those 3 things, you like, what are you doing? Because I thought you were working on this thing. Well, guess what? You are failing as a leader in creating clarity about expectations. Should probably fix that.
Yeah.
Same thing with, what are you going to accomplish? If what they say is different than what you had on your list, that's a failure of clarity. And so much of it boils down to clarity. But this is, if you get in a consistent rhythm of doing this alone, just the one-on-one meeting done well, is just do that, and you will have so many fewer issues and concerns to worry about from a performance perspective.
I love those. And a couple of points on that. Don't cancel
Ever.
on your people.
Ever.
I remember I had this leader who they just canceled them all the time. They scheduled them because they were required to do so. That was part of HR coming out and saying, best leaders do this. They have weekly one-on-ones. Inevitably, an hour before, 2 hours before, rarely a day before, canceled. Oh, you don't need it. You don't. yes, I did need it. I needed the connection with my leader. So never cancel. And number two, I love your advice of employees participate. Come to the meeting prepared, because far too often on the employee side, they let the manager take control, and then they complain at the end of the year that their appraisal isn't what was expected.
Right.
So be an active participant in your own performance.
Yeah. And it's just a matter of setting the expectation. So there's
Mm-hmm.
one of the hacks that I recommend to managers is to have the employee own the calendar invite for the one-on-one, because that way, at least for me, it's the employee's time, right? It's not my time. It's the employee's time with me as their leader. And so this needs to be prioritized, which also means if I really need to reschedule, then I have to go to them and say, hey, I need to reschedule this. What works for you? But there's just having to go ask the employee to reschedule it is sort of like it creates this layer of like, you don't do that easy cancel. And so it at least psychologically tends to help a lot of managers hold to that time and be more serious about it. Because, nothing says you're not important like canceling the 1 hour a week or whatever that you had set aside for me. It's like, no, I have other more important things to do than to invest in a conversation with you. Like, it's the worst thing you can do.
Let's hit a couple of more hot topics, because
Okay.
I think our HR pros and even our leaders are going to find so much benefit in this. So what does the perfect end of year conversation look like? And part two of that is going to be, and when do they hold their perfect merit and bonus compensation conversation?
So the perfect end of year conversation is about the upcoming year. It's the perfect, because by the time you get to the end of the year, guess what? Performance for last year is over. And you managed it or you didn't. But there's nothing you're going to do in appraising it or assessing it or reviewing it that's going to change what happened last year. It is what it is. I hope you measured it so you at least know what happened.
Right.
But the only thing we can change now is what happens ahead of us. And so the conversation should be entirely anchored around, what did we learn this year? Where would we like to have maybe done some things differently that would inform what we're going to do next year? How would we show up differently for this the next time we do it, or whatever? And then let's calibrate our goals and think about what we're going to do, so that it should be all a forward leaning review, or not even review. End of year is all about getting ready for next year, because that's all that matters. Right. That's how we stay in business, is performance on the next play. And so that, I'll leave that at that. As far as the merit, I think the problem in answering that question is that so many organizations we've trapped ourselves in this sort of what I call is sort of like a best practice cycle. That, like, there were some things that somebody decided to do back in 1949, and then somebody else started doing it, and then other people started doing it, and pretty soon everybody's doing it. And this is what happens. We do this over and over. We take a practice that somebody did out of necessity, and we think there was some other intention behind it. We just keep repeating. And so comp practices have been like, this is what's happened to us. We're boxed into all these different practices. And I think everything starts with, what's your compensation philosophy? When so many organizations don't do this, they don't have the conversations like, how are we going to pay? What do we believe about pay? What do we think pay should do? How do we want to compete? All of these things. And then from there, you make a decision. But I think there's just such a lack of intention and such a lack of clarity around what we're doing. So get clear about your philosophy and your intentions, and then sort out how you're going to approach it and what the right cycle is, because there's infinite number of good ways to do it that comply with the law.
Drop the mic on that one. Okay, so we are coming to the end. We're almost ready for rapid fire questions, which is an audience favorite. But before we go there, you had put out an offer. I believe it was on social media, maybe for to offer one-on-one sessions to your followers, and you had a response. Tell us about the response and tell us about real quickly what you learned.
Yeah, I just was irritated about the media narrative around remote work and what was happening. Like, remote work's over, we're all going to the office, and then you have an article that says the office is dead, and you're like, what? Like, what? And so, yeah, so I sent an invitation actually to the main place was to my email list. And I was just like, hey, if anybody
Mm,
wants to talk about this, I'm irritated. I think it's more complicated than that. I'd love to talk. And had 50 people grab spots on my calendar.
mm,
And it like completely decimated my calendar for a month, which is, it was delightful and terrible at the same time. But I
yes.
had some amazing conversations. And the biggest thing, my biggest takeaway, I was trying to sort out like what's happening, like what is actually happening with the evolution of work. And there's some conclusions or a few big things that I'll give you. One is, if you're listening to this and you're trying to sort this out in your organization, hybrid, remote, whatever, like if it feels like it's uncertain and you're just kind of stumbling around trying to figure it out, you're exactly where almost everybody else is. Everybody's trying to figure this out. The people that are doing it the best, that are having the most success, are co-designing the solutions with employees.
Mm,
And they're doing it with great intention. They're involving employees. They're phasing it. They're testing. They're coming back and saying, well, let's try this for the next 6 months
hmm.
and we'll see what happens. And if
Brilliant.
whatever it is they're changing, when they're changing schedules, they're giving employees a whole bunch of notice, because
Mm,
they're recognizing that when we change people's schedules, we disrupt people's lives. And
hmm.
it takes time to fix that. It took us time to adapt when COVID tipped us upside down, and it's
Hmm.
taking time to adapt when you try to put us back right side up. And so there's that going on. The other thing that I thought was really interesting was, I asked one of the questions I asked all the time when I talk to these organizations. I said, okay, what are you doing? Are you in hybrid? Are you in office? Are you remote? What? And they'd tell me, and I'd say, what was the decision process? How did you arrive at this decision?
Hmm.
And the most common response by a mile was executive preference.
Mm,
This is what our executives wanted to do. It's just a gut
mm,
feeling. We think it's the right thing. Culture is important. Everybody's coming back. But that's happening everywhere. And then some CEOs are saying, well, production is suffering and communication is suffering. And you've got employees going like, no, it's not.
mm-hmm.
No, it's not. I can show you evidence that it's not. So what are we doing? And so there's some really fragile things. And the last thing I'll give you is, hybrid is the most common solution. Everybody's going to some version of hybrid, 2 days in the
Hmm.
office, 3 days out, 3 days in, whatever, 4, 1, whatever. And what I heard from most of the people I talked to, most of the HR leaders I talked to, was that hybrid was a compromise. And it was
Mm,
largely a compromise that nobody is particularly thrilled about. That everybody was kind of like, well, it's the best we're going to get. And so,
mm,
what I would suggest is that we are in the second inning of a 9 inning game when it comes to sorting this out.
mm-hmm.
There's a long ways to go. And like I said, if you are in the midst of this in your organization, um, go talk to your employees, right? Find out what they need. The other thing I would say is that the organizations that are thriving through this too are really putting a lot of trust in their managers at the team level. They're giving them a whole bunch of autonomy,
Mm-hmm.
saying like, talk to your team and sort out what works best for you. Here's the non-negotiables, but after that, you guys sort it out. And that's working. It's working in a lot of places, but you got to have trust. If you don't trust your people, doesn't matter what your policy is, it's going to be flawed.
Do you think that culture does suffer because people are hybrid or even in the office 2 days a week and at home three or some variation thereof? Do you think culture is really suffering or is actually culture getting better?
Based on the conversations I've had and the people I've talked
Mhm,
to, I don't think those two things are interlinked. I think regardless of whether I've talked to some remote companies that have really strong culture, and people are super engaged. I talked to some
Mhm.
companies that had all in person and they were really engaged and had strong culture. And I've talked to everything in between. The same is true
Mhm.
on the other side. So it's not about hybrid or remote or in
Mm.
person. It is about the intention with which you manage your culture. Do you know, are values clear? Are behaviors clearly defined? Do your leaders behave in a consistent um, and positive way? Are they investing
Mhm.
in relationships? All of those things are the things that build culture. And guess what? You can do that. You can do that virtually. You can do it in person. There's all kinds of ways to do it. So I think it's a false narrative with those that are saying, no, our culture is suffering. If the culture is suffering, it's because of poor leadership. It's not because of remote or hybrid or anything else.
A second drop the mic. Okay, so we could keep going
Of
for
course.
hours, of course. And but we have to move on to our favorite segment, which is one of our favorite segments, which is rapid fire questions. Are you willing to play?
I am. I'm ready.
All right, let's do this. What are bad recommendations you hear in HR being passed off as best practices?
Never be friends with the people you manage.
Mhm.
That's my favorite. Certainly, there's a line there, but that's my favorite. Um, and the other is just annual performance appraisals, like we've been talking about.
Yeah. What advice would you give to someone just starting out in HR?
Know the business, know how the business creates value, and know that your job is not to enforce compliance and rules. Your job is to help people perform, right? To create a condition to cultivate performance and be about that. Study humans, don't study best practices or rules.
When you get overwhelmed, how do you refocus?
This is something I'm not great at. So I don't know that I have a great answer. I guess for me it's going back to what's most important. I try to
Mm.
I think return to my values or what is it that I'm really trying to accomplish and then start from there.
If you could have your own billboard that would reach millions of people, what would your message be?
Love more, judge less.
What is the book or books you've given out most often as a gift and why? And you cannot say your own.
It's not my own. So, Fierce Conversations by Susan Scott, I think, is the
Mm.
best management and leadership book probably ever written. I think it's amazing. It's so full of incredible value. So, I've given that one a lot. And the other one is Predictably Irrational by Dan Ariely. I think
Mm,
that's a should be required reading for anyone that's in leadership and HR.
that's great. Those are two we haven't heard yet. Who's getting employee engagement right today? That could be either a leader or a company.
I'm not rather than name drop some company because then like a month after this they'll do something silly. I will say what it is it's the organizations who are putting, and I see this over and over and over, that they're putting employee voice and employee needs at the center of how they are making decisions about their organization and how they do work.
Mm,
And so you can see this happening. There's companies that are doing return to office correctly. For example, they're co-designing it with employees. They're hearing,
mm.
they're listening first, finding out what the needs are, and then they're deciding the path forward. So I think that's the common characteristic.
What's the biggest challenge you think businesses will be facing in the next 5 years?
I think it's going to be figuring out how to exist in a world where work doesn't look anything like it used to look like. I think
Mm,
we're in at on the cusp of traditional employment as we've known it for the last 100 years completely disintegrating in front of us.
mm,
How we work, where we work, the fact that we're attached to one employer versus many, the hours, the nature of the work we do, how we work with technology, all of that is shifting so quickly. And unless we adapt to a completely different frontier of work, I think a lot of organizations are going to get left behind.
What is the main takeaway you want to leave with our listeners today?
Work is a relationship for employees. And if you want to succeed as an organization, if you want to engage, you want higher performance, then you have to lead with relationship in everything that you do.
Where can people go to learn more about you?
JasonLauritsen.com. If you can spell my name, you'll be able to find me, or plug it into the Googles and you'll find lots of ways. But JasonLauritsen.com or LinkedIn, that's where you'll find the most current and relevant stuff.
And we will put both links in our notes section of this podcast. So thank you, Jason Lauritsen, for joining me today. It has been so enlightening and such an incredible pleasure.
Thanks, Berta. Thanks for having me.
I really hope you enjoyed this episode. Thanks so much for watching. We would love it if you shared your thoughts on any of the topics we discussed in the comments below. And if you got value from the video, it would mean the world to us if you hit the like button and subscribe to the HRMorning channel. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Voices of HR.